There's snacks in the back. There's something like either apple cider or party or hero puppy. Hope so. This is you want to move up farther so they're closer to the end. That's okay. Oh, yeah. This here is. And then it's on the lake. You can have it. I'm not sure exactly. You can have it. I don't even believe it.
Yeah, that's CDB, AB, ABB, OP.
I just want to make sure. Yep.
Welcome, everyone. We're having a few more people join online. It's almost time to start. Just to get a few things out of the way here, this is kind of a hybrid model tonight. We're having a few people in the library listening to our speaker tonight. We're using a new camera and it seems to be working really well. We're kind of excited about that. This is a webinar format for those of you who are online, and your cameras will be turned off as well as your microphones. So you won't be able to speak to the speaker or anything, but you can type in the Q&A section down on the bottom of your screens if you have questions, and we will take questions at the end of the presentation. This will be live streamed to YouTube, so we will be able to watch this at a later time if you have friends or family that would like to see this at a later time, or if you wanted to revisit it. So that will be live streamed to YouTube. And I am Natalie Cruz. I work here at the library and I kind of moderate this and kind of the go-between here. So we'll go ahead and get started. Tonight, we're very happy and excited. I think it's going to be a pretty good presentation. Keith Meacham, he is a local railroad historian, and he's going to be sharing stories and photos of historic railroad structures, locomotives, wrecks, It's got lots of information for us, and so sit back and relax online, and if you want to type in some questions already that you have, go ahead and do that. We'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So go ahead and take it away, Keith.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. My name is Keith Meacham, and somehow now I've been hung with the title of Roehl Railroad historian. It's something I took an interest in because my dad worked for the Sioux Line for 43 years. And I had an uncle on the Sioux Line. It's always interested me, and I've taken an interest in it. And kind of got exposed to it from the outside in, so I kind of know how it works from the outside. What it takes to make a train, I guess is the best way to put it. And long story short, if it wouldn't be for the railroad, none of us would be here tonight listening to me talk. And you can say that about any community west of Stevens Point all the way to Ashland. But Marshfield is unique because it grew to be the size it is without the aid of water or a lake within its corporate city boundary. And it's all due to the railroad.
I'm going to pop in here, Keith, if you could speak a little louder. We're having a little trouble hearing you online.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Where was I? Oh, now Marshfield doesn't have a body of water going through it or a lake within its corporate city boundaries. Everything that Marshfield became came from the railroad, including the Marshfield Clinic. Although there are a lot of people who consider that connection to the clinic to be tenuous. But if it hadn't been for a Sioux Line conductor talking to Dr. Carl W. Dagey and giving him the idea to stop here and talk to Father, I think it was John Einstein at that time, we probably wouldn't have a Marshfield Clinic here either. Can we have the first slide? These are the 6 most important men in the development of Wisconsin Central, which is why we're all here. The original 3 were Gardner Colby and his son Charles and George Reed. I nominated George Reed for the most popular or most what's that going on?
Marshfield's 150.
Yeah, and I nominated George Reed because if he hadn't done the groundwork to lay out the Wisconsin Central where it went, we wouldn't be here. He unfortunately is a kind of a tragic kind of a figure. Very trusting, and the first company he's involved with was called the Manitowoc in Mississippi. It became a part of the Milwaukee Lakeshore and Western. They built from Manitowoc to Reedsville, which was named after Judge Reed. And then he's kind of forced out. So he throws in his lot with the Colbys to form the Wisconsin Central, and they started building in 1871 in Menasha. They managed to get the charter from the state. It was supposed to be from Portage to the head of lakes at Ashland. They started building in Menasha. And the first year they built from Menasha to Stevens Point. In the winter of 1871, 1872, they built across the Wisconsin River. What's the matter?
We're gonna move the owl closer to you.
Oh, boy. Oh.
And Natalie will tell us if your head is cut off or anything.
Probably the best thing that could happen. Anyway.
We're hearing you okay. It's just if you turn away, sometimes we lose what you're saying, but if you could, yeah, just kind of turn where you are right now, that speak up, that'll help a lot.
Taking direction. Oh, boy. They bridged the Wisconsin River in the winter of 1871, 1872, and in April of 1872 began building north. They eventually come to Marshfield in July of 1872. They built all the way to Colby, which at that time was known as Salem. And they actually graded the railroad all the way up to Worcester, or is it Worcester? Worcester. Worcester? Is it really? They go as far, back then it was known as Section 101. That's what they do in the first year. And we're lucky we got a railroad at all, because in 1873, we get the panic of 1873. And all the track workers walked off, left their tools. So that left their president, Elijah Phillips, to build a railroad. And poor Elijah didn't know what he was doing. He did manage to finish the Ashland segment from Worcester to Ashland, but did such a poor job of it, people wouldn't ride the train over the bridge at High Bridge. a lot of people would stop the train, wait for the train to stop and walk across because it was far safer to go that way. Well, then he proceeds to build Stevens Point to Portage to fulfill their charter. He didn't do a very good job on that either. Poor guy. He was the kind of guy you wanted around after the railroad was built, not building. And the shareholders of the Wisconsin Central are getting madder and madder and madder because Charles Colby is over on the continent, supposedly looking for investors. Nobody knows if he was or not. But they wanted a general manager who could put his thumb down on expenditures. And that's how Edwin Hale Abbott comes about in 1877. The shareholders basically stage a coup and they get rid of Gardner Colby and Elijah Phillips. They bring on Edwin Hale Abbott and Frederick Finney. Finney would build the Wisconsin Central from Abbotsford to St. Paul and from Menasha to Chicago and make it into a first-class railroad. George Reed gets kind of eased out by the Colbys and he's gone by the time any of this takes place. He ends up dying in a hotel fire in Milwaukee in 1883, I believe it was. Gardner Colby was so taken aback by losing his railroad, he dies in the latter half of 1877. But from then on, it would be the Colby and Finney Construction Company that would build Wisconsin Central, and both Colby, Finney, and Abbott would run the railroad until 1893. In 1893, they had been picked up at that time by the Northern Pacific and leased. And by that time, Northern Pacific owed the Wisconsin Central $600,000 and they weren't paying. So the shareholders stepped in again and they stopped several projects in their tracks. One was Grand Central Terminal in Chicago. Another was the Marshfield Cutoff, which would have shortened the main line by 20 miles between Marshfield and Bateman, which is just outside of Chippewa Falls. And the third one was a new main line utilizing the Portage line south from Stevens Point to Portage, with a new line built through Madison and turned east to go to meet up what they had already built from Des Plaines to Williams Bay. That was all done. After that, Marshfield Cutoff becomes the Greenwood line until 1982 when the Sioux line abandoned that. Charles Colby takes perverse pleasure in firing Frederick Finney. He always blamed Finney for Gardner's death. And from there on, it runs up till 1909 when the Sioux Line Railroad, ironically, a railroad that was built as a Chicago bypass, leases the Wisconsin Central for 99 years, beginning in 1909. And that basically brings us up to about 1920. If you want to run it up to the next one, not him yet, but I'll get to him shortly. Now I gotta feed this. Marshfield in Texas was one of Upham's railroads. He comes to Marshfield in 1878. And I still see he located here in Marshfield because it was just about the center of where all his timber holdings were. He had timber holdings, I call it Puff Creek, but it's now today the wilderness camping area of Northwood County Park. And he had some holdings northwest of Unity. And then he had what was the Clark County Extension, which became the Greenwood line. North of Chile, it actually was northwest of where County Highway Y and County H cross or meet. So northwest, I think about 3 miles. I'm really not sure. That's the main reason Upham wanted to locate here. This is the Marshfield, Texas. That's the one that passed my house. This is the one that originally ran out to Northwood County Park. Sioux Line, Wisconsin Central did all the work laying track for Upham. He did a lot of that. When you get into the old authorizations for expenditures on that, you can't figure out why all of a sudden they're taking this track up and putting this one in. We did a lot of contract work with them. Wisconsin Central was only too happy to do it because that brought some money. And then he had his own locomotive, which was kind of a local Celebrity old van, which was an inside connected Taunton 440. They bought 13 years before the Civil War. Cantankerous piece of equipment that ran when it felt like it. Kind of reminded me of the tractor on Green Acres. You remember that? It was pretty close to that. Oh. This is the Clark County extension. The original, what became the Greenwood line, which by agreement between the Wisconsin Central and Upham, the Wisconsin Central was going to upgrade the first 8 miles and start building the milepost 8 northwest to Bateman. This was an idea to shorten the main line by, I think, 20 or 12 miles, depends on who wrote the article. I really don't know how much it would have shortened it. But nothing ever came of that, because of what I told you about the panic of 1893 and everything stopping. I know that very well because that was my dad's territory when he was traveling. I rode with it many times. Greenwood line is kind of not only a fetish, but also a sore point. And this is New Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha. A mouth-filling title if you need one. They actually were voted to come here because at the time, Upham was our mayor, and his ideas, and when Don and I were setting up the slide presentation, his idea of getting the Omaha here was mostly selfish, because he knew that you get 2 railroads here, they're going to fight against one another, and you get a better price. So it actually was very good business. Hamilton Roddice would do that later on. He would play the Sioux line off against the Northwestern and get a better price from one or the other. It's just good business. If I make it sound like there's something wrong, I really don't mean it that way. You have to really admire those guys for using their head on that. The Omaha, by the time it builds here, is actually a wholly owned component of the Chicago Northwestern. They had been controlled directly by Northwestern since 1882. They had built the Neillsville, I believe it was by 1877. And by the time they started building here, they had kind of just had it Neillsville for about a year. Well, then he started building this direction, and then we had the fire of 1887. They stopped at Granton. And it's 4 more years before they get here. And I can't figure out why it took them that long to build. It wasn't that rough of terrain coming over here. I wonder sometimes if they just kind of built something, then they waited for some money, and then built some more, and then waited for some money. But once it got here, Marshfield starts to become a rail center, and because now you've got competition, you can ship on either railroad. And that made a big difference for Marshfield. Because now companies want to come here because you have 2 railroads that go to Chicago, and they'll fight against one another, and you can get a better price from one or the other. That's just what it. Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western. This is the railroad that got started also by Judge Reed. He started out in Manitowoc as the Manitowoc and Mississippi. Everything back in those days was connected Lake Michigan to the Mississippi River. The Wisconsin Central starts out like that. Green Van Western started out like that. Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western starts out in Milwaukee, built up the Lakeshore through Fort Washington, Sheboygan, to Green Bay. Actually, no, the original main line turned at Manitowoc and went to Pequanna. And it went through Pequanna, Appleton, and managed to find its way up to Elam. And part of this was because Marathon County wanted a railroad to build to the west and into the county to open the county up. Because Wisconsin Central went so far to the west, they actually go in and out of Marathon County several times because they're right on the county line. And the only place you had real development was right where the rail line was. And it wasn't very much on either side. So they Actually, the county board in Marathon County did cut out some grant money to the Milwaukee Lake Shore and Western to build well into Western Marathon County. The original idea was to build the Marshfield from Rib Falls through Halder and Rosellville, but that never happened. Instead, they went all over the place to come to Marshfield. Eventually, they get here, and Omaha had the roundhouse built, and it makes me wonder if because they were both controlled by the Northwestern by that time, if there wasn't some now support out there. Now, this is Ben Heineman. He's an Anago native, lawyer by trade. He becomes the head of the Chicago Northwestern in 1956. He remains in control of the Northwestern until he sells it to the employees in 1972. A very intelligent man. You're supposed to hate him because he changed railroading, not necessarily for the better, but most of the ideas you see with railroads today came from him. Unfortunately, it's because of his ideas, we don't have a Northwestern in Marshfield anymore. They wanted to focus on, well, their term, the gravy, which would have been any traffic with volume. We didn't have volume here anymore. And then when the Marsh Line sub was damaged in spring rains in 1972, they cut through service between Marshfield and Fond du Lac. So that was pretty much the end of that. And they focused on the gravy, which was mostly hauling Union Pacific traffic from Council Bluffs to Chicago. And that's what they always were, was Union Pacific's eastern arm. You go to the next one. In all my research, I can't find a photograph of the first Marshfield depot. I think it was like Milledorf. I can't prove that. But this was kind of, Don sent me a photograph on the internet. It looked awful, like an awful amount like Colby. And I told him that. And I'm thinking that the first Marshfield depot looked like that, because knowing railroad practice at that point in time, that looks like more like the structure we would have gotten, because Marshfield was that big at that stage. The next one down. This is the most frustrating photograph I've ever had in my life. This is the second Marshfield depot after it had burned. I don't think you could find it either. And we looked for another photograph of this, but there's one clue that tells me what kind of building it was. It's this attic dormer on the end. Spencer was like that, Unity was like that, Boyd was like that. So I know it's like the second class station of the Wisconsin Central. Boy. This was a locomotive going by, a coal locomotive. And the spark come out the stack and got under it. It burned slow enough they were able to save everything that was in the depot. Next one, Don. And the replacement built in 1909, just as the Wisconsin Central was being leased by Sioux Line. The automobile my dad was assigned at the time as traveling agent, Sandy Saddlebox signal truck, and Larry Andrews Ford Square wagon. You tell I know this real well? Gee, I don't think I ever hung around the railroad. Next one, Don. My dad in 1960. And behind him is the signal control box for the interlocking. This is the box for the train order signal, which you can see standing outside the building. This is westbound indication, eastbound indication. I wish I'd have saved that clock. I wish I'd have saved that signal case. I did. My mother would have loved that if I come home with that. What the hell would you have been doing with that now? Next one, Don. This is the man who gave me my first ride on a locomotive, Doug Glenn. This is when he retired on August 25th, 1972. Roger Ingram, Elmer Wilson, Don Ingram, that's local and car foreman, that was Roger's dad, Matt Nealis, Ranger Hill, Lenny Hintz, Ted Bratton, Jim Hurley, Augie Augustine, John Starosta, Doug Glenn, Bill Shoup, not Bruce, Bill Shoup, Jerry Halleck, and engineer Ron Sutheimer. I rode with Ron Sutheimer when I got my ride between Roehl and Greenwood. Just, I actually was at the depot when they took that photograph. Because I had ridden with my dad that day on the traveling agency. We got back and even Charlie Brand had to get his oil truck in the way. This is not the photograph that ran in the paper. The photograph that ran in the paper just showed Doug standing over there about where Teddy Bratton is. Of all those guys, there's about half of them are about Marshfield residents. Roger died of lymphoma. Don died of congestive heart failure. I think Bill Shoup is gone now. John Roehl is gone. I don't think there's too many guys left in that photograph who are alive anymore. That really makes you feel old. Next one, Don. This is the Marshfield Depot in 1969 looking east. And the express office, this little sliver right here. Hub City Jobbing Company when it was still in business yet. And this is early enough, they've taken the train order signal down because the hole is still in the roof of the bay window. Here's the base for it. This is the mail shed that went up in 1964, I think it was. Next one down. Saddest of the sad. Funeral train. 2-line steam engines going to scrap. And actually, this is a neat photograph because back here, I couldn't figure out what this thing is here. It turns out that's a dumpster. That's when they were remodeling the depot and putting all the freight personnel over here. And it's unique because that portico that was on the back is still here yet. They hadn't torn that off yet. The roof had been re-shingled. They got rid of the old tile roofing and it re-shingled it. And when they took that portico off the back, for the rest of the building's life, until it became the end of the line over it, or end of the line, Royal Tokyo, there was always a different color shingle where that portico had been. Next one. Ah, the freight house. You don't realize how important this building was until you see it. This is where the freight personnel were. And for Marshfield, do we know what the population was in 1916?
Not off the top of my head.
Probably about 8,000 or 9,000, probably.
Yeah.
For Marshfield to get a building this big, this proves how much less than carload freight was generated here. Building was 250 foot long over the concrete loading dock in the back. And originally this was split in half in the middle in the offices. This half was a warm room. This half was all offices. And down in the basement, they had meat hooks. They could actually hang meat down there. That's how you just keep meat cool. That's when the Sioux Line had built it. This is after it had been abandoned. And this is before some kids got in there and broke in and tried to set fire to the place. And please forgive me for saying that if they had set fire to it, it would have been a mercy to them. That building was in terrible, terrible shape. There were pieces of the floor gone. No wonder Paul Schreiner wanted to get his stuff out of there. He had at least in the store, storing stuff in there. When I was a kid, we first moved to town. Hub City Foods or Hub City Jobbing Company was in there. And they were unloading cars there. And I remember Dad wanted to go over. We just bought that Nova we had. And he wanted two 50-pound bags of sand. So we went over there to get them. And I remember seeing open cases of Jello, open cases of Cheerios on the floor. And they backed up every morning and they'd load the trucks, you know, for routes and whatnot. So this got used until probably about 1973. And after that, they leased it to Paul Schreiner, and he had like bathtub shower combinations for mobile homes in there. Next one down. Northwestern's first depot. That's about 1900. That's a typical Omaha design. I question the color. Because I think Omaha depots were probably more yellow than they were white. But this was a fairly big depot because it was both depot and freight house. This gets hit by a load of pulpwood in about 1907. They had a train that derailed in front of it, and the car of pulpwood let itself in the building rather rudely. One of the clerks jumped out the back window. They repaired it, and then in 1916, they built this depot. Go ahead. I've got a couple more. I don't know if you take this one. This is where somebody had a pair of scissors and paste, and this is not a Northwestern locomotive. These people are all out of something else, and they're all black and white. And they started pasting them on there. That's the way it looked when we moved here in 1967. When they closed the roundhouse, they bricked in this covered area on the end, and they put shower in there and lockers, and that's where the crews went to work. That was their locker room after that. But there was, as I remember, there were lockers in where the waiting room had been too. This end was a waiting room. Go ahead, jump down. This is 1973, after through service, Fond du Lac has been cut. Look at that track. And I watch 100-car trains go over that stuff. How did it stay on? The scale house. Next one down. Northwestern Roundhouse, originally built with 6 stalls in 1890 when they arrived here. And this actually, I just found this out recently. That roundhouse gave Marshfield bragging rights, because now we're just as good as Wisconsin Rapids, Stevens Point, and Wausau. Well, Wisconsin Rapids had the Green Band Western Roundhouse, which I forget how big that was, 4 or 5 stalls. Plus they had a Milwaukee Road and a Northwestern engine house there. Stevens Point, of course, had the Sioux Line facilities, which a roundhouse, and at one time there were shop facilities there, and the car shops. And Wausau had the Milwaukee Road roundhouse, which I think was 6 stalls, and a 2-stall Northwestern engine house. Now we were on, once they built that, we were on the same playing field as the other communities. When I found that out, I was like, what? Next one down. This is the backside. This is a rare shot. And this came from Bob Lotz, who was here in the late 40s, early 50s. This is courtesy of Matt Holman. Bob took a lot of photographs here in Marshfield. This is really rare. You don't get to see this end of it. That's the backside of the roundhouse. This house is still there. But this is just about the back of Hiller's Hardware now. Maybe a little bit further to the east. This is Cedar Street going across here. This is taken after they had added stalls 7, 8, 9, and 10. And originally, I've got Father Fulmar's book about Northwestern roundhouses and engine houses. And there's a photograph that I have where these new stalls had the same arched doorways as the first 6. So at some point, the Northwestern raised the door frames so they get their larger locomotives in here. The original roundhouse only had 65-foot stalls. That's not very big. That was big for the engines at the time. But by the time they added on, they were already starting to use like 10-wheelers. And as you can, we always figured this is a Sioux Line engine hanging out here, probably a Mikado. And they can't get the doors closed because even though these were 90-foot stalls, the engine still hangs out. It was big enough for the engines at the time when they built it. But by the time the 1950s rolled around, this is probably about 1950, 51. The engines with numbers on the back are Chicago Northwestern engines. 402 would be a Omaha, 317 would be an Omaha locomotive. Next one down. The old 5008. Now, this is a Joe Stauber photograph. This is Joe's uncle. The 5008. Now, this is the reason we didn't put it on here when we were setting this up. The 5008 is a one-of-a-kind locomotive built by the Baldwin Locomotive Works, ordered in 1947, not delivered until 1948. Instead of having 2 locomotives in it, it had 1, and the other section became a baggage compartment. The model designation was DR641000. Baldwin knew how to really make some model numbers.
So that round thing in front, that's the turntable.
This is the turntable pit.
So they turn the train around.
And if it hadn't been lined for the track next to it, when the air, see, it had a leaky air compressor. And if it hadn't been lined there, when the engine came out, it would have been in the pit, but it hit the turntable instead. Lucky for them. I've got photographs of engines that went into turntable pits too. Like, go ahead. This is the infamous hoot nanny. This is what I call the super gasimatronic car. Northwestern always had a lot of trouble in the holidays season with a regular gas electric that had a passenger compartment on RPO and a baggage set. On the Fond du Lac train, they'd actually end up having to pile a lot of the parcels and the mail in the passenger compartment because they ran out of room. Well, this is how they thought they were going to get around that problem, and it was supposed to tow this 60-foot heavyweight coach. Well, for the most part, they re-engined it with a Sterling diesel, with 2 Sterling diesel engines, which apparently didn't work real well. This thing ended up in the shop more often than when it was running. And if the rail was wet, if there was snow or rain or wet leaves on the rail, the thing would sit there and spin and wouldn't go nowhere. I'm not really sure. I think hoot nanny, I've never heard it applied anywhere else but this area. Seems to be like a local term, I guess is the best way to put it. When the train was finally taken off, when they ended that passenger service, it was a steam locomotive, an RPO baggage, and a 60-foot coach. So that thing didn't work as well as they thought it was going to. Next one down. Another one of Northwestern's morphodites. The Baldwin VO1000 switch engine that's been re-engined with a 8-cylinder General Motors diesel. I almost got a ride on that engine. That thing was here quite a bit. This is July 9th, the day before my birthday in 1976. In 1976 is when the Northwestern ended through service. Next one down. My friend John Roehl was up here terrorizing the countryside in April of 1976, and the 1037 was here. They always had a regular locomotive changeover. This engine would be the final switch engine that was assigned to Marshfield on September 30th, 1976, when through service was done. On October 1st, it was gone. Okay. This is the demolition of the roundhouse in 1960. And the Northwestern got rid of it because they could get Gallimax to build in that spot. Rather than pay property taxes on this, it was easier to have somebody who was going to be a rail customer build there instead. Notice there's a Fairbanks Morris baby train master in the picture. I don't know who did the demolition. Never did find that out. Map of, believe it or not, this is where Pick and Save is now. There was a lot of railroad stuck between Cedar. This is East 8th and East 6th. This is 7th. There was a lot of railroad crammed in this area. And, oh, no, go ahead. That's even better. And this is an aerial view. The original Washington School, which is now Pick and Save. The depot, and it looks like there's some maintenance away cars sitting here. The turntable, the roundhouse, the coaling shed, the sand house. This is Cedar Street coming across here. This is the Northwestern's crossing Watchman's Tower at Cedar. And you see a part of the old freight house, which used to be the original wooden depot, poking into the photo up here. Their water tank. Right here. This is nuts deep too.
Keith, where would Salt Ash be? Because I live on Salt Ash.
Off the photograph, I'm sorry.
Well, it's gotta be like.
Cedar, Cherry, it's off by here. I think it's up in here.
Okay.
Because here's the fairgrounds, exhibition building, grandstand.
I'm going to pop in here real quick. If somebody answered or asked a question in the audience, we're going to have to repeat it for our online people because they're missing out on what the questions are. And while I've got your attention, I think I'm going to ask some questions that some of our online people have asked.
Okay.
By Steve Kleiner, he wanted to know what was the role of the U.S. Post Office revenue on railroad profits. And the REA, which had a terminal east of Maple Street, was the RPO use important in getting mail to Marshfield?
Yes, and at one time with the amount of mail that we had between the Northwestern and the sewer line, the Marshfield Post Office actually had become a sectional center. I don't know if that means anything to anybody. I'm not sure what year that was, but at one time Marshfield made mail delivery twice a day. That's how much mail came here.
Okay.
Toward the end, mail contract is what made the Northwestern's passenger service and the sewer line 1 and 2 break even. Without that mail contract, the trains probably would have came off sooner, because it made the difference between the trains actually making a profit or breaking even and losing. That's why when the post office terminated the contract, 1 and 2 were gone, not very long after that. Then Chicago Northwestern, about a year later, wound up all their passenger service. So it was quite important.
He also asked, can you talk about the Chicago Northwestern Depot? Like when it was built, he said it seemed like progressive architecture, like it was kind of like prairie style.
It could have been, but it was a design that was unique to Marshfield itself. There was no other building on the Chicago Northwestern that I'm aware of that looked like the Marshfield Depot. It's a pity that we lost it. I'm not sure really who the architect was. I'm under the impression that it was designed by the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha in their St. Paul offices.
Okay. I'm excited because a train is going by right now.
What that horrible noise is.
Right behind me, and it's being noisy. So
I'm looking right at it. I'll trade you. Is that all you got?
there's one more.
Okay.
Let's see here. What street would that depot, Chicago and Northwest Depot, have been on?
It was right on Central Avenue.
Okay, and where was the roundhouse then in Marshfield?
The roundhouse used to be on the corner of South Cedar and East 8th streets.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. This is the old News Herald photograph of a carload of coal that had gotten away from the switch crew on the Northwestern when they were working what was called the butter tub track. It started out at the foot of Central Avenue, ran alongside the Northwestern behind Marshfield butter tub, Marshfield bedding, and connected with Northwestern's connection off of their main line to Maryland, and eventually found its way over by where John Grossfire used to live and connected to Marshfield in Texas, right in front of FF Mingle Ready Mix. And it had a pretty darn good grade going downhill. And they somehow lost control of this carload of coal, and it took off down and started getting a little faster until it ran into the earth berm that carried Central Avenue up over the tracks, and managed to rearrange the sidewalk and the light post. I'm not sure what year that was. Gene Greenwald found that when he was going through old News Herald negatives at the Upper Mansion. We never did find out what year that was. I'm guessing probably 1920, 1930 maybe.
I'm thinking it would be after, because of the negatives we have go back to about 1940.
Okay, that could very well be. And of course, coal was still being used back then for heat and for making power. Could have been a carload for Connor lumber. I really don't know. Could even a carload for Boone Brothers, because they burned a lot of coal to make steam and air for their operations at the box company. Next one down. This is about the time the Northwestern restarted through service between Maryland and Elam. The thing about this photograph is when the Northwestern shut off through service, they packed this yard downtown full of bad order freight cars. From every railroad they had merged or taken over, the thing was just packed. It was a horrible eyesore back in the day. But we got a lot of this is a repowered Baldwin road switcher. I'm not sure what it's mated with. This is the 1041. That's another repowered Baldwin switch engine. The Boost 10925, which I think Dale Euclides' dad worked on a lot when he was still employed. This is standing on the freight on the scale track. I wish I had gotten a decent photograph of that scale. I really do. Now I kind of regret that. Hey, engine 112, Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha, class I-1 10-wheeler. They're just going to work. But notable in this photograph, this is the Lewis Hotel. This is where the downtown motel would eventually build, and now, what is it called?
Holiday Inn.
Oh,
the Louis Rivers.
Louis Rivers.
The Rivers Hotel.
Rivers Hotel is in there now. Our first clubhouse for the train club was right next door to that. I would guess this is probably about 1950. That poor engine looks terrible, and Northwestern wasn't taking care of their steam engines by that time anymore. This is the coal shed. There's another Bob Lots photograph. We didn't have real modern facilities in Marshfield. It was a 1-ton bucket and a jib crane operated by engineer just to pick the bucket up. They swing it out over the tender. Whoever the poor guy was that was up there would dump it into the tender. Then they put it down, and right behind here, they didn't get it in Oakland hopper cars. They shoveled it out of gondolas into those buckets. Then they turn it and put it up there again, dump it. A very labor-intensive operation. The 50 I think was retired here in Marshfield. It disappears about 1955. It was here for a long time, I know that. Another Bob Lots photograph from Matt Holman's collection that he shared with me. I got this from Larry Easton. It just showed up in my inbox one day about 10 years ago. This is engine 317 going to work. This is Nuts Deep, which at this time was owned by Tony Colbeck. Don wondered if this said Nuts Deep up here. No, it's Blatt's beer. Marshfield Bedding, McCrillis's Ice House, New Kirchen Oil. Get a load of that. This is the original electric crossing signals. They used to be right in the center of Central Avenue, built on a diamond-shaped concrete barricade. And those crossing signals got more cars than the trains did. Got a photograph of that at home too. Guy is sitting behind the steering wheel after he hit it. He's got this most bewildered look on his face. The original Northwestern interlocking. This went up in 1915. Prior to that, all trains had to stop and flag. So you imagine that there, in 1903, we had arrival and departures of 38 passenger trains a day. I don't know how many freight trains. But when they got to the crossing, they had to stop and flag, which means the engine had to stop 200 feet either side of the crossing. Send the head brakeman out. He had to plant a flag or a lantern, and then wave the train across. And when the rear end came along, the rear brakeman would pick up the lantern or flag, get back on the train, they'd take off. So in the evil world, we're already at war in Europe in 1914. We're not as a country yet, but it has started when they decide they're going to build this tower. And here's all the control rods. It wasn't a very big place. I managed to find out through, I think it was Scott Peterson, that it had 12.5-foot walls, a perfectly square building. And the interlocking machine had space for 16 levers, only 14 were used. I can't figure it out. If I counted this right, there should be 16 in there. One for each derail and one for each signal. And I say, I don't know. That was in the northeast quadrant west of Peach Avenue. Technically, if Ash had come down the way it was supposed to, that would be right in the middle of Ash Street. And behind there, you can see a part of the pickle plant, Libby McNeil and Libby, which later became Green Bay Foods. And in 1955, I think it was, Northwestern, after they had gotten rid of their passenger service, said to the Soo Line, we're going to give you control of the interlocking. And this replaced that. Oh, well, I remember that thing. That was what was poking out behind my dad. Now, I got a friend on the internet. He's a signal maintainer for Union Pacific. Sent me an article about this when it was put in 1946. Apparently, during World War II, Marshfield became a terrible, terrible bottleneck for the Soo Line. And they actually put in power switches on each end. The original signal box is this. And you can see this demarcation here. So they were already planning to take over the interlocking just after World War II. Doesn't happen until about 1955. And this was the Northwestern. And if I remember how it went, this is LR9, LR11, LR13, LR15. I can't remember what the outside ones were. L9 controlled the Nakusa line over the Northwestern. L11 was the main line over the Northwestern. L13 was the siding over the Northwestern. L15 was the Northwestern going over the Soo Line. When you threw, and there was a little red light in each one of these. When you threw this, these three went red. So you couldn't turn it back again until you waited a certain amount of time. There was a indicator light here. I think that only came on when he had a train going around the north leg of the Y. Otherwise, that thing would have been on all the time. They were running back and forth between downtown and the yard out in the sticks out here. Okay, Tom. This should answer your question. Here's the tower. This is Peach. This is Arnold. This is North Ash. This is Libby McNeil and Libby. This is People's Gas Company. This is Lakeshire and Marty Cheese Company. This is the Marshfield Stockmen's Association. That was a stockyard. And off the photograph is the Soo Line's water tank. This is the track that serviced, it was off of the switchback that went up into Libby McNeil and Libby. One of the things I learned riding with my dad, there's a reason why companies get certain types of cars and how often. I haven't been able to find out what People's Gas did or how many cars went in here to the Lakeshire or the pickle plant. I can't find any of that. Very frustrating. In 1922, the Soo Line and the Northwestern began talking about a mutual aid agreement, a 50-50 mutual aid agreement, where at Rhinelander, the Soo Line would take care of the Northwestern switch engine and local locomotive assigned to Rhinelander. And at Marshfield, the Northwestern would do that for the Soo Line. So the 2109 would be the local switch engine. The 2448 would be the Nakusa line power. And I'm not sure how the agreement was worded, but the Soo Line tried so hard to keep from having to assign an additional engine here when business was up. He even ran a separate job from Stevens Point over here to avoid having to, because then they had to pay for everything out of pocket. And the Soo Line was so cheap, we would not do it. They were. Next one done. Soo Line 456, that's a class F9 280 consolidation, Nakusa line power. I think this is about 1950. Another Bob Lots photograph. You go too far?
Did I?
No, 1010 is next. This must be about 1951. The Soo Line started assigning their 282 Mikados to the Nakusa line job with some rather disastrous effects on the Chicago Northwestern track. Northwestern track was awful light. And what they built from Princeton to Marshfield was only 72.5 pound rail. Well, they put one of these things on there and it tends to leave the rails spread and a little broke. But it was, I got about like 3 different photographs of Suline Mikados here. Next. This is typical of Marshfield's Suline switch engine in Marshfield, 46010 wheel. This is a former Wisconsin Central engine, and a sister of hers is preserved down at North Freedom, 2654. This is at the Marshfield Roundhouse on the turntable, looking to the would be the northwest. Another Matt Holman collection photograph. Okay, down. The 2380. Good view of the coaling shed. 2380 is the Nakusa line power on that particular day. It's standing next to the roundhouse, which is just out of sight of the lens. A model Alco RSC3. Notable in that it only had 2 traction motors on a truck. It had 6 axles. The center axle was used to spread the weight on light rail. So using it on the Nakusa line worked pretty good. The problem was, they seemed to think that 6 axles meant all sorts of power. And with no traction motor on that center one, this thing would get stuck and wouldn't go anywhere again. It would just sit there and spin because it couldn't get no traction. It became a favorite with some of the crews because then you got extra pay. The Arnold Street record, 1966. I guess, was it you that found the article or was that Mike Myers?
I don't remember doing it. It must have been Mike.
Must have been Mike. Mike found the article on this, and according to what the news hero wrote, there was a broken rail just to the north of this crossing with the Sioux line. They dragged like about, you'll see that later on in this, there were 13 photographs of this. They dragged like 3 or 4 of them across Arnold Street, tore the crossing all up. Then as you're starting to go into the, see, this is the line that would go out behind the hospital up here. This crossed not far from here, crossed Maple and Central Avenue where Little Caesars is now. And then it went in an angle across Nagy. And then it went past the brewery and behind the hospital. They got on this curve, and this is just about right behind Reuben Wagner's house on Ash Avenue. That's out of sight over here. 9 cars, and I think most of it was covered hopper cars are all carrying the line. Okay, done. Huh. Carload of wood chips. Or what was the wood chips? This is the next day. Anyway, here you can see where they had dragged those cars across. This originally was a switch here, and over in here was, I never found out what bulk oil dealer that was.
We talked about it being
Mobile, but he was
mobile.
He was next to the Sioux line. I don't know who was here.
When Reiner first opened his lot on 6th Street, there's a station on 6th Street. That's when we were getting permission to put something up in that area.
Oh, okay. Well, after this wreck, then he pulled that out. They turned cars over all over the place. And this is probably one of the last times that Northwestern actually brought one of their own cranes in to do something. After this, it was either Berg wrecking or Hulcher. 2 more from the next day, from the day after. This one is interesting because this is just about behind Reuben Wagner's house. And legend has it that Reuben's wife was doing supper dishes in the sink. And the train is going by, well, she thought nothing of it. I mean, it looked like any other Northwestern train that was just kind of crawling out of town. The house began to shake and she hears noise and she looks up, sees this car starting at the house, dropped the dishes and ran out of the house screaming. And Reuben's sitting there in his easy chair watching TV and he watches her go right out the front door. I don't know how true that is, but it's a good story. Northwestern gets even with the city of Marshfield and knocks over one of their dump trucks at Lincoln Avenue. This is Fitzgerald. I believe this is Lenny Cordes. I don't know who this is. Don't recognize the police officer either.
So Keith, that, we can have them right there in the picture. Would that be now, that trail that goes through there?
Yep, this is a trail.
That's now a trail.
That's now a trail.
Yeah. Okay.
Originally with two tracks out there, and they hit this dump truck and turned it over, driven by Roof Esser, if anybody remembers him. You probably.
You hook the back wheel.
Well, that's how they did it.
All they taken with was just the steps on that engine.
That was
The
it?
back handle.
Well, 2 years later, they retired it and scrapped it. I thought maybe that, well, at least nobody got hurt. He was the street superintendent for a long time in Marshfield.
Wasn't it last week before that?
He could have
Was
been.
that Ray Jersey?
Marcellus.
Marcellus, yeah,
Oh, so,
yeah. I forget what relation he is to him.
okay.
That's a Marshfield News Herald photograph too. Pair of F units on the coach track, not very far from here. That's where they had the ramp track where Figgies loaded their trailers of gifts and catalogs. And this is the power for the Nakusa line, and that's all this line would ever run. And the guys who had to operate on these things, they hated it because they had to. I had a guy, I knew him for years, Wayne Krieger. He said it felt like your arms are going to pull out of the sockets after you switch for 8 hours of one of them things because there's just no place to hang on. You had to hang on like this instead of like this. But that was what they used on the Nakusa line all the time. And there was nothing like standing up there at the depot in the morning when they back number 26 down the main line. And two of these things are screaming to God and everybody, they're going to move this train if it's the last thing they ever did. And engine would go by and you'd get covered with sand because they're blowing sand on the wheels to try to keep moving. And they'd get over Chestnut Street and they'd stop and then the train would run back into it and push them along another 3 cars the other direction. Crossing signals would go back on. Then when they leave, it was kind of anticlimactic because they're going downhill. They just released the brakes and you just kind of coast right by them. All done it at the breakneck speed of 5 miles an hour. And you wonder why people in this town hated trains. When I was a kid, I thought the Sioux Line owned the Lewis, Masabi, and Iron Reach. But every year, when the grain rush would get tight and Sioux Line motive power was stretched to the thin, they'd lease a bunch of these engines from the Masabi. So they were just as common around here as Sioux Line engines. I don't know who this is, but this is a Jack Stagey. This is a Jack Stagey photograph. The 741 is brand new. I don't know who this is. He's an official of some sort. He looks really happy to have his photograph taken. This is the Sioux Line servicing facility after they had vacated the arrangement with the Chicago Northwestern. This is at Vine Street. This is an old Sioux Line boxcar that was taken off its trucks. They cut windows in it and doors. This was the local and car foreman shanty at Vine Avenue. And this, they call it the engine track, but it also serviced Felker oil products, which later became asphalt products. 3-headed signal that guarded the diamond. Photographed by my dad. That's the Marshfield yard office. They brought that here on a flat car in 1965. It had been the depot at White. Eventually, this is 1967. It must have been about 9 years later. They eventually moved it down the yard lead to about where it had to be. Then they put new windows in it. So otherwise, the guys who were the yard clerks trying to follow the engines were kicking cars back and forth on the tracks. They had to stand out in all weather and try to keep up with the engines. It was in the original yard office is right here. By that time, they gave that to the car department for the carman to work on it. And then he brought that down here. Eventually, the original yard office gets replaced with a steel Sioux Line boxcar, which Canadian National just got rid of about 5 or 6 years ago or more. I was with Dad when he took that. He was swearing his head off because he couldn't get the other yard office out of the frame. Because he worked there when he was relieving the agent of White. And he found out that thing was here, so we just had to go and get a photograph of it, which is fine. Go ahead, Tom. Ah, yes. I'm not going to tell you the story that my dad told me about this. I'll stick with what the News Herald reported. 26's counterpart was coming home, and they got hit in the middle of the train by two guys. One was a Michael Esser, and the other guy's last name was Spatz. And it turned out that they hit him hard enough that they knocked two cars off, which they dragged almost to Highway 10 before the air hoses parted. And they ended up sitting out at Highway 10. They tied up out there, and they worked all night to put the train back together. And in the next morning, Don Ingram, who you've seen a photograph of already, well, he lived out here on Highway H, right across from Prince Corporation. He tools on out there to do his inspections, and he figured, well, I'm going to get a leg up on my work. So he went and he started a fire in the stove. And it's still full stove set. But it's a strange thing. He never noticed there was no heat shield around the stove. So we got a good stove fire going, and he thought to himself, there, now I won't have to listen to the rear brakeman and the conductor piss and moan about a cold caboose. So he leaves, and there was no other trainman on there, and I think it was Mike Higgins, and I don't know who else they sent out there, just brought the train in. There was nobody on the caboose. This caboose goes over 4th Street at 7, 8 o'clock in the morning. People are watching it go by, and there's flames shooting out of the side of it. It goes past Weyerhaeuser offices. They called the fire department. So did two of the people that watched it go across 4th Street. Ran down to the fire station, told them this was happening. Just as the guy who was standing here, this is the belt line switch. This connected the Nakusa line to the yard lead. He's giving car counts to the engineer, and he's looking, and there's smoke all over behind the train. This thing comes into view, and there's these big flames coming out the side of it. He yells, "Hotfoot." About that time, the firemen got there. They cut the caboose off, and instead of backing the train up the belt line, they took it out on the main line and backed it down in the yard that way. While these guys put that out. Burned it. I can't find out which caboose that was. I would love to know. But the number is just off the photograph. The windows are all broke because of the heat. It looked like hell when it was coming off the track. Oh, yes, and we'll entertain any questions now.
Thank you, Keith. I've got a couple here from online. Let's see.
My guidance counselor wants to know.
Someone asks, even in the early 1950s, I saw an early morning steam passenger train headed past Brewery to Wausau. I'm told maybe in the 1930s, there were high school students from Chile daily taking the train to and from. Could you talk some about local and long distance passenger service?
Most of your passenger service on both railroads was local. I don't know if they actually brought any students into Marshfield on the trains. It's possible. I've never heard of it, but I don't rule anything out. Okay. Most of your passenger service around here, and the reason the Northwestern got mad at it would be like grandma getting on at Neilsville and riding out to Granton to see her son at the farm. That's usually what it was. And it wasn't. And a gentleman just gave me a validated ticket here from the Greenwood line. They went from Spokeville to Roehl. It cost them 10 cents. I thought they paid about 9 cents too much.
There's one other question. Was the 2448 the same engine type wheelbase as your old girl?
Yes,
Okay.
they're different classes. The 2448 is a heavier engine than the 2442. Better known as my 111-year-old girlfriend. Ron?
That's all I had. If anybody else has any other questions, you can type them in the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, or you can go ahead and take some questions from the audience there if you want. If it just might be kind of difficult for people online to hear it, so you might want to repeat the question if someone asks you one there and then answer it there.
I'm just going to say that when I was like 4 years old, my mother took me to Riplinger, thing on a sewer line. And then the train, would stop and drop us off. And then we were ready to come back. The person manning the station there would flag the train down. And stopped and picked us up and took us back to Marshfield. So we had, that's my first train ride at about 4 years old. Rippling, I think.
Well, you're one up on me. I didn't get my first ride till I was about 6.
I'm a little older.
And just a tad. And then it was from my house to the power plant and back.
Well, at the power plant had the Marshall.
Shelby?
Marshall Chemical.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we went to the people there and they were all wrapped up with like cardboard and so on. We picked them up and unloaded the chairs. And I still have them.
Oh, wow. What that was, is Shelby Weiser was telling us about how they went to the depot in Granton to pick up, LCL, less than carload. That's what that was. Because in a small town like Granton, the depot did everything. They were also the Railway Express agency. Instead of having a freight house in a place like that, the depot was. That's why Loyal had such a great big depot. It was also the freight house. Greenwood was like that. Once you got out of Marshfield, this small town depot did everything. It was the Railway Express. Yep. Yep. I wish I knew where my photographs went. I had a set of photographs of a wreck that occurred there. I can't remember what year. I'd like to say 1963. But I don't know where that set of, I got him from Gene Greenwald. I can't, and I asked him about it. He's, oh, we never had anything like that. Well, what the hell was I looking at?
Are you talking about the railroad?
Wreck. I mean, they had cars scattered everywhere
In Granton?
in Granton.
Yeah, I just, a couple of weeks ago, I seen with a gentleman, Steve Parker, he's got a phone.
Okay. Well, that's after they had cut through service and they were serving,
Yeah.
coming up
and
here
there
from
was a
Maryland.
section earlier one too that- But,
I'll find it one of these days.
yeah,
You took all those photographs, like 70s and that, or those ones that you took?
Some of them are. Some of it, like this is Joe Stauber. A lot of the black and white stuff on the Northwestern, that was Matt Woolman collection. His uncle Bob Lots took those. Some of it's Marshfield News Herald. One of the art office my dad took. And I was along with him that day. He just said, come on, we're gonna go someplace. Okay, got my car and went down there. Took a picture of a building I didn't understand.
Was he an agent of the flight too?
No, he was working relief.
Oh,
He relieved the agent of plate.
oh,
And I've got a picture somewhere in one of the old Sioux Line historical magazines showing it when it was still with the depot at White. Looked kind of funny, because it was so much smaller than everything else, you know. Here they put it on a cribbing when they brought it here to Marshfield. So that the only way it was going to work. That was the first place I ever saw a Playboy centerfold. Stapled to the roof, and Dad put his hand over my eyes. He says, "Don't look at that."
was that at White or Marshfield?
That was here at Marshfield. Could have been at White. Who knows? That was in the middle of nowhere. Yes, sir. At one time, they did. I remember that. Dad would come to work the next day and he always had to take down the mileage and send that into point. He gets so kicked off because he couldn't figure out how you guys put so many miles on it in one night.
Would you mind repeating that question? People couldn't hear it online.
It wasn't, really wasn't a question.
Oh,
Somebody
more-
knew my dad.
oh,
He was mentioning about, well, the clerks used to use the traveling agent's car, I think it was
Your attention, please.
73.
The library will be closing in 20 minutes. All of today's meeting room reservations are now expiring. If you're using one of our meeting rooms, please gather your things and exit the room. If you have materials you would like to borrow, please check them out now. The library will
Oh
be
my God,
closing
those
in 20
voices.
minutes. Thank you.
sorry about that. That's the pains of being in the library here with our
I can
closing
give you,
announcements, but this is a good time for me to pop in here too. I want to thank everyone online for coming and thank all of you for attending this. And thank you also for your patience and for hanging in there with us. We're testing the waters on different ways that we can reach our audience the best. And we're trying out this new camera setting and we're learning by trial and error. And hopefully it'll be perfected more and more each time we do things. The next spoken history talks will be April 14th. And it will be on the history of the Marshfield Public Library. And I will be the speaker for that. We'll also have family history talks on April 13th. And that will be about, are you ready for the release of the 1950 federal census? And our very own Vicki Schnitzler will be presenting on that. So hopefully everyone can join for those two as well in April. I'm going to let you guys keep asking questions if you want. You got another 5 minutes before we're going to probably kick you out of the room. So thank you so much, Keith, for talking with us tonight about this. You had some wonderful pictures. Yeah, go ahead, clap. Thank you very much.
So Keith, did your dad ever come home and rumble about the traveling agent's car being stuck again?
oh, I heard more about that than I care to talk about. Oh,
Looking at driver. I got stuck once,
Gary?
yeah.
Geez, I haven't seen you in how many years?
Oh, it was quite a few.
Well, Keith is going back there. I want to invite people to help yourself to apple
Oh,
cider.
how many
There's
years has it been?
cereal Chex Mix and
Well,
Girl Scout
the last time I
cookies.
seen you with that,
So go help yourself. before you go.
I'd rather have you. What? I'd rather you. Yeah, I would.